The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the tree-lined streets of Millbrook, a quiet suburban town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. Everyone except Sarah Bennett. She was driving her sleek black Mercedes carefully through the unfamiliar neighborhood, her GPS guiding her to a speaking engagement at the local community center. Her perfectly pressed navy suit and pearl necklace reflected her usual professional style, even on this warm Tuesday afternoon. Sarah wasn't just any visitor passing through town. At 35 years old, she had already made a name for herself as one of the country's leading civil rights attorneys. Her work had helped change laws in 3 states, and her powerful speeches about equality and justice had earned her a position as the national spokesperson for several prestigious organizations. But none of that mattered to Officer James Peterson, who was parked in his patrol car behind a large oak tree, radar gun in hand. As Sarah's car approached the intersection, Officer Peterson's eyes narrowed. The stop sign at the corner was partially hidden behind overgrown branches, and many locals had complained about it being hard to see. But complaints were just complaints until someone did something about them, and today, that someone wasn't going to be him. Sarah slowed down at the intersection, but according to Officer Peterson, she didn't stop completely. The flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror made her heart sink. Even though she knew she hadn't done anything wrong, she did what she always advised others to do, turned on her interior lights, kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, and took slow, steady breaths. Officer Peterson took his time approaching her car, his hand resting casually on his holster, a detail Sarah couldn't help but notice. She had given dozens of lectures about these exact moments, about staying calm even when fear and anger threatened to take over. Now, she was living through another example she would likely share in her next speech. License and registration, Officer Peterson said flatly, not bothering with the greeting or explanation for the stop. His flashlight beam moved around the car's interior, lingering on Sarah's designer handbag and the leather briefcase in her passenger seat. "Of course, officer," Sarah replied politely, her voice steady and clear. "My license is in my purse, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's all right with you." The officer nodded stiffly, his flashlight never wavering. Sarah moved slowly, deliberately, remembering the countless times she had instructed others on proper behavior during traffic stops. She handed over her documents with a small, professional smile. Officer Peterson's eyebrows rose slightly as he read her license, noting her Washington, D.C. address and her impressive credentials. But his expression quickly returned to its previous stern look. "You ran that stop sign back there," he stated, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "I apologize, officer, but I'm certain I came to a complete stop," Sarah responded calmly. "The sign was partially obscured by tree branches, but I did see it and stopped fully before proceeding." "Ma'am, I was watching that intersection, and you rolled right through it," Officer Peterson said, his voice taking on an edge of irritation. "This is a safe neighborhood, and we take traffic violations very seriously here." Sarah knew better than to argue, but she also knew the importance of stating her position clearly and respectfully. "I understand, officer. However, I want to respectfully disagree with your assessment. I am very careful about following traffic laws, especially in residential areas." Officer Peterson's face hardened. Without another word, he returned to his patrol car with her documents. Sarah sat perfectly still, watching in her side mirror as he took an unusually long time writing up the ticket. She used these minutes to send a quick text to her assistant, updating her about the delay to her schedule. When the officer returned, he handed her a ticket with a flourish that seemed almost triumphant. "This is a citation for running a stop sign. The fine is $300, and court instructions are on the back if you wish to contest it." His tone made it clear he expected her to just pay the fine and move on. Sarah looked at the ticket, noting the excessive fine amount for a first-time alleged offense. She knew the standard fine in this county was typically much lower. Taking another deep breath, she folded the ticket carefully and placed it in her purse. "Thank you, officer," she said quietly. "I will be contesting this citation in court." Something flickered in Officer Peterson's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or annoyance, but he simply nodded and told her she was free to go. As Sarah drove away, now even more carefully than before, She couldn't help but think about how this incident would become another powerful example in her ongoing fight for justice and equality. Little did Officer Peterson know, his actions today would soon become part of a much bigger story, one that would shake the foundations of Millbrook's judicial system. 2 weeks after the traffic stop, Sarah Bennett walked into the Millbrook County Courthouse at exactly 8:45 a.m. The building was an old stone structure with high ceilings and wooden benches that had seen decades of worried defendants come and go. Sarah chose a seat in the middle row, her leather briefcase placed neatly beside her. She wore a simple but elegant black suit today, her hair pulled back in a professional bun. The morning traffic court session was set to begin at 9 a.m. sharp, and Sarah watched as the room slowly filled with other people. Most looked nervous, clutching their tickets and whispering to each other. A young law student sat in the back corner, taking notes for what appeared to be a class assignment. He seemed particularly interested in the proceedings, his laptop open and ready. Sarah noticed something interesting as she observed the room. The court clerk greeted some people warmly, directing them to the better seats near the front, while barely acknowledging others who were left to find their own places in the back. The pattern was clear to her trained eye. The preferential treatment seemed to follow a troubling trend based on appearance and race. At exactly 9 a.m., a side door opened, and the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Richard Harrison presiding." Everyone stood as the judge entered, his black robes flowing behind him. He was a tall man in his 60s with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, carrying himself with an air of absolute authority. Judge Harrison began calling cases in alphabetical order. Sarah watched carefully as he handled each one. A young white college student who had been speeding got off with just a warning and a smile. An elderly Asian woman, struggling with English, tried to explain her parking violation, but was quickly fined without being allowed to finish her story. The pattern continued, case after case. "Sarah Bennett," the clerk finally called out. Sarah stood smoothly, straightening her jacket as she walked to the podium. She could feel Judge Harrison's eyes following her movement, his expression changing ever so slightly as he looked her over. "Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison said, peering down at her ticket over his glasses, "you're here for running a stop sign on Oak Street. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Sarah replied clearly, her voice carrying through the courtroom. She noticed how the judge's eyebrows rose slightly at her professional tone. "Officer Peterson's report states clearly that you rolled through the stop sign," Judge Harrison said dismissively. "He's one of our most reliable officers. Do you have any evidence to contradict his observation?" Sarah began to speak. "Yes, Your Honor. First, I'd like to point out that the stop sign in question is partially obscured by—" "Miss Bennett," Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice sharp. "I'm not interested in excuses about visibility. The sign has been there for 20 years, and locals managed to stop just fine." "Your Honor," Sarah continued calmly, "I would like to note for the record that I am not a local resident and therefore—" "That's exactly the point, isn't it?" Judge Harrison cut in again. "Out-of-towners think they can come through our community and ignore our traffic laws." His tone was becoming increasingly condescending. The law student in the back was typing furiously now, clearly aware that something unusual was unfolding. Other defendants in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, shuffling papers on his desk. "I see you drive a rather expensive vehicle. Perhaps a significant fine will help you remember to respect our traffic laws." He looked down at her with a stern expression. "The standard fine for this violation is $300, but given your attitude and the need to ensure compliance, I'm setting the fine at $500. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Even the court clerk looked surprised. No one could remember the last time Judge Harrison had increased a traffic fine above the standard amount without any aggravating factors. Sarah stood perfectly still, her expression composed despite the clear injustice unfolding. She had expected something like this might happen, but experiencing it firsthand was different from theorizing about it in her speeches and articles. "Your Honor," she said quietly but firmly, "before you finalize that decision, I would like to make a statement for the record." Judge Harrison waved his hand impatiently. "Make it quick, Ms. Bennett. We have other cases to hear." Little did he know that the next few minutes would completely change the atmosphere in his courtroom, and ultimately, the entire trajectory of his career. The law student in the back had just pressed record on his laptop, about to capture a moment that would soon go viral across the nation. Sarah Bennett stood at the podium, her heart beating steadily as she faced Judge Harrison. The courtroom had grown unusually quiet, with even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations coming to a complete stop. Everyone could sense that something important was about to happen. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice clear and professional, "I would like to address several concerns about the proceedings today." She pulled out a small notebook from her briefcase, though she didn't really need it. She had been preparing for this moment since the traffic stop. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, an annoyed expression crossing his face. "Miss Bennett, if you're planning to waste this court's time with complaints about the fine, I should remind you that—" "Your Honor," Sarah interrupted firmly but respectfully, "I am not here to complain about the fine. I am here to address a pattern of behavior that I've observed in this courtroom over the past hour." She paused, letting her words sink in. The law student in the back straightened up, his fingers hovering over his laptop keyboard. Judge Harrison's face reddened slightly. "Ms. Bennett, you are out of line. This is a traffic court, not a forum for your personal observations." But Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "In the past 60 minutes, I'd have witnessed this court handle 15 cases. In each case involving a white defendant, the average time spent was 4 minutes, with 3 cases resulting in dismissed charges. In contrast, cases involving defendants of color averaged less than 2 minutes, with no dismissals and maximum fines imposed in every instance." The courtroom erupted in hushed whispers. Judge Harrison banged his gavel sharply. "Miss Bennett, I am warning you." Furthermore, Sarah pressed on, her professional demeanor never wavering, "I've noticed that defendants of color were consistently interrupted while attempting to present their cases, much like you're trying to interrupt me now." The court clerk had stopped typing, her hands frozen over her keyboard. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably near the judge's bench. The law student in the back was now recording everything on his phone, trying to be as discreet as possible. Judge Harrison's face had turned from red to purple. "Miss Bennett, you are in contempt of court. One more word and what, Your Honor?" Sarah asked calmly. "Will you fine me again? Have me removed from the courtroom? Every action you take right now is simply providing more evidence of the systemic bias present in this court." A woman in the back of the courtroom stood up, then another. They had been defendants in earlier cases, and Sarah's words had given voice to what they had felt but couldn't express. Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order. I will have order in this court." But his voice had lost some of its previous authority. For perhaps the first time in his career, he seemed unsure of himself. Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a business card, placing it carefully on the podium. "Your Honor, I want to be very clear about what happens next. You can either listen to what I have to say, or you can continue trying to silence me. But either way, this conversation will happen." The judge stared at her, his anger mixing with growing uncertainty. The courtroom remained silent, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. "Who exactly do you think you are?" Judge Harrison finally asked, his voice carrying a mixture of contempt and curiosity. Sarah smiled slightly, the kind of smile that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this question. She reached into her briefcase one more time and pulled out another document. "Well, Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the now silent courtroom, "since you asked, I think it's time we had a proper introduction. But before I tell you who I am, I'd like to submit this formal complaint to the State Judicial Review Board, documenting everything I've witnessed in this courtroom today, including your behavior during my case." Judge Harrison's face paled slightly as he realized this was no ordinary traffic court defendant. The law student in the back was still recording, capturing every moment of this confrontation. The other defendants watched in amazement as Sarah Bennett stood her ground, about to reveal her true identity and change the course of justice in Millbrook forever. The tension in the courtroom had reached its peak. In the next few moments, Sarah would reveal herself not just as a civil rights attorney, but as someone whose words would soon echo through every major news outlet in the country. Judge Harrison's world was about to change dramatically, and he didn't even know it yet. Sarah Bennett took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders as she prepared to introduce herself properly. The entire courtroom seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Even the ceiling fans seemed to slow their spinning, as if they too wanted to hear every word. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice carrying a quiet strength, "my name is Sarah Bennett. I hold a Juris Doctor degree from Harvard Law School, where I graduated at the top of my class. For the past 8 years, I have served as the lead civil rights attorney for the Equal Justice Initiative, and I currently act as their national spokesperson." Judge Harrison's face began to change as he processed this information. The smug superiority that had marked his expression just moments ago started to fade, replaced by something that looked very much like concern. Additionally, Sarah continued, pulling out a folder from her briefcase, "I serve on the National Commission for Judicial Reform, where we specifically study and document cases of judicial bias across the country. In fact, I was in Millbrook this week to give a keynote speech at the State Bar Association's annual conference on judicial fairness." The law student in the back was now standing, his phone still recording everything. Other people in the courtroom had pulled out their phones too, sensing they were witnessing something historic. But most importantly, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger, "I am a citizen who has just witnessed and experienced firsthand the kind of systemic bias that continues to plague our justice system, the very bias that I have spent my career fighting against." She opened the folder and began laying out documents on the podium. "In the past hour alone, I have documented 17 instances of discriminatory treatment in this courtroom. I have recorded the exact times, sentences, and disparities in how different defendants were treated based on their race." Judge Harrison finally found his voice. "Ms. Bennett, I don't know what you think you're doing, but—" "What I'm doing, Your Honor," Sarah interrupted firmly, "is exercising my right as an officer of the court to report judicial misconduct. I'm also informing you that my team has been monitoring this courthouse for the past month, gathering data on sentencing patterns and judicial behavior." A gasp went through the courtroom. The court clerk had completely abandoned any pretense of typing, her mouth slightly open as she watched the scene unfold. "We have reviewed over 300 cases from your courtroom," Sarah continued, pulling out more papers. "The statistics show that defendants of color receive fines averaging 70% higher than white defendants for the same offenses. They are interrupted 4 times more often when speaking, and their cases receive less than half the consideration time." Judge Harrison's face had lost all its color. He reached for his gavel but seemed to think better of it, his hand falling limply to his side. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her tone softening slightly, "I didn't come here today looking for this confrontation. I came here hoping that perhaps the data we had collected was wrong, that perhaps there was another explanation. But what I witnessed today, including your treatment of my own case, only confirms our findings." She turned to face the courtroom, acknowledging her audience for the first time. "To everyone here who has faced similar treatment, I want you to know that your experiences matter. They have been seen, documented, and will be addressed." The woman who had stood up earlier was now crying silently, nodding her head in agreement. Others in the courtroom were wiping their eyes or looking down at their hands, years of similar experiences washing over them. Sarah turned back to Judge Harrison, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the past few minutes. "Your Honor, I am formally requesting that all cases heard in your courtroom today be reviewed by an independent judicial panel. I am also submitting this evidence," she held up a thick folder, "to the State Supreme Court's Ethics Committee." The law student's phone kept recording as Sarah reached into her briefcase one final time. "And this," she said, pulling out a press release, "is going to every major news outlet in the country within the next hour. Because what happened in this courtroom today isn't just about a traffic ticket. It's about justice, fairness, and the fundamental right of every person to be treated equally under the law." Judge Harrison slumped in his chair, finally understanding that his comfortable world of unchecked authority was about to change forever. The small-town traffic court had suddenly become ground zero for a national conversation about judicial bias, and Sarah Bennett had just ensured that everyone would be paying attention. By 6 o'clock that evening, the video of Sarah Bennett confronting Judge Harrison had spread across the internet like wildfire. The law student, Michael Chen, had posted the footage on social media, and within hours, it had been viewed millions of times. Major news networks were already running the story on their evening broadcasts. Sarah sat in her hotel room, watching the coverage unfold on multiple news channels. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since she left the courthouse. There were calls from CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and dozens of other media outlets. Her assistant, James, was busy managing the flood of interview requests while Sarah prepared for what would come next. The video shows a remarkable confrontation between civil rights attorney Sarah Bennett and Judge Richard Harrison, a news anchor reported, as clips from the courtroom played on screen. Sources say this may be one of the most significant exposures of judicial bias captured on camera in recent years. Outside the Millbrook County Courthouse, reporters had gathered in growing numbers. Local residents stopped to watch as news vans with satellite dishes parked along the street. Many people held up their phones, recording their own videos and sharing their stories of experiences in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Maria Rodriguez, the woman who had stood up during Sarah's confrontation, was now being interviewed by a local news station. "For years, we knew something was wrong," she said, tears in her eyes. "But who would believe us? Who would listen? Today, Miss Bennett gave us all a voice." Inside his chambers, Judge Harrison sat alone, staring at his computer screen in disbelief. The video had already reached the state Supreme Court, and he had received a call informing him that he was temporarily suspended pending an investigation. His secretary had already collected 3 boxes of formal complaints that had poured in since the morning. Back at her hotel, Sarah received an unexpected call from the governor's office. The governor wanted to meet with her first thing tomorrow morning to discuss statewide judicial reform. What had started as a simple traffic ticket was quickly becoming a catalyst for major systemic change. Social media was exploding with reactions. The hashtag Justice Like This was trending nationwide, with people sharing their own stories of facing discrimination in courtrooms across the country. Legal experts were being called to talk shows to discuss the broader implications of what had happened in Millbrook. "This isn't just about one judge or one courtroom," Sarah explained during a quick phone interview with a national news program. "This is about a system that has allowed bias to go unchecked for far too long. What happened today simply made visible what many people experience every day." Around 8 o'clock, Sarah's phone lit up with a text from Michael Chen, the law student who had recorded everything. "Miss Bennett," he wrote, "I hope it was okay that I recorded and shared the video. I'm a first-year law student, and what you did today taught me more about justice than a whole semester of classes." Sarah smiled as she replied, thanking him for having the courage to document the moment. She knew that sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest actions: a student deciding to record, a woman deciding to speak up, a community deciding they had finally had enough. By nightfall, protest groups had organized a candlelight vigil outside the courthouse. Hundreds of people gathered, holding signs that read "Justice should be colorblind" and "Equal treatment under law." Local church leaders and community organizers took turns speaking, sharing their own experiences with the justice system. In her hotel room, Sarah continued working late into the night, preparing documents for the upcoming investigation. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. The state Supreme Court had just announced a comprehensive review of all judicial appointments in the state, citing the events in Millbrook as a wake-up call. As she looked out her window at the city lights, Sarah thought about how one moment of standing up for what was right could create ripples of change throughout an entire system. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more interviews, and more work toward reform, but for now, she allowed herself a moment to appreciate that sometimes justice came in unexpected ways, even through a simple traffic ticket in a small-town courthouse. 1 week after the courtroom incident, the State Judicial Review Board launched their official investigation into Judge Harrison's conduct. The small meeting room at the state capitol was packed with investigators, legal experts, and civil rights observers. Sarah Bennett sat at one end of the long table, surrounded by stacks of documents and data collected over the past month. The lead investigator, Dorothy Martinez, began reviewing the evidence. "Over the past 5 years," she announced, reading from a thick report, "Judge Harrison handled approximately 12,000 cases. Our preliminary review shows a disturbing pattern of discrimination in sentencing." On a large screen behind her, graphs and charts displayed the stark differences in how different groups were treated in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The numbers were even worse than Sarah had initially suspected. Not only were fines higher for people of color, but payment plans were denied 3 times more often, and jail time was imposed for minor violations at an alarming rate. "What we're seeing here," Sarah explained to the board, "isn't just about conscious bias. It's about a system that has allowed these practices to continue unchallenged for years. She pulled out additional files from her briefcase, spreading them across the table. We found similar patterns in other courtrooms across the state. Meanwhile, in Millbrook, the effects of the investigation were already being felt. The courthouse had implemented immediate changes. New signs in multiple languages were posted, explaining people's rights. Court observers sat in on every session, taking careful notes. The partially hidden stop sign that had started it all had been cleared of branches and properly positioned. Local community leaders had formed a Citizens' Justice Committee, meeting regularly to discuss their experiences and propose changes. Maria Rodriguez, the woman who had stood up in court that day, was elected as the committee's first chairperson. "We're not just talking about problems anymore," Maria told a local reporter. "We're actually working on solutions." Ms. Bennett showed us that change is possible if we stand up and speak out. Back at the state capitol, the investigation continued. Judge Harrison was called to testify, looking much older and more subdued than he had in his courtroom. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his tie. I never thought of myself as biased," he said quietly into the microphone. "I believed I was treating everyone fairly." He paused, looking down at his hands. "But the numbers don't lie, do they?" Sarah watched him carefully. In his voice, she heard something she hadn't expected, the beginning of understanding. It wasn't just about punishing one judge. It was about changing a mindset that had become so deeply ingrained that people couldn't see their own biases anymore. The investigation expanded beyond Judge Harrison. Other judges in the state began voluntarily reviewing their own records, wanting to address any bias before being called out. The state Supreme Court announced mandatory bias training for all judicial employees, from judges down to clerk staff. Local law schools started using Sarah's courtroom confrontation as a teaching case. Michael Chen, the law student who had recorded the video, was invited to speak at various universities about the importance of documenting injustice. The most powerful moment, Michael would tell students, wasn't when Ms. Bennett revealed who she was. It was when she showed that she had done her homework, that she had the data to back up what everyone knew but couldn't prove. As the investigation continued, more people came forward with their stories. The review board's office was flooded with letters, emails, and calls from citizens sharing their experiences. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, building a clear picture of systemic bias that could no longer be ignored. Sarah worked late into each night, reviewing cases and preparing recommendations for reform. She knew that this investigation could become a model for other states, a blueprint for how to identify and address judicial bias across the country. "This isn't just about one judge or one courthouse anymore," she explained during a press conference outside the Capitol. "This is about setting a new standard for justice in our country. It's about making sure that when we say equal justice under law, we really mean it." The investigation would continue for months, but already its impact was clear. Something fundamental had shifted in the way people thought about justice in their community, and it had all started with one woman who refused to accept an unjust fine and one judge who was finally forced to confront his own biases. 3 months after the courthouse incident, the changes in Millbrook had spread far beyond what anyone expected. The small town had become a testing ground for new judicial reforms, and other cities were starting to take notice. Sarah Bennett returned to Millbrook to see these changes firsthand. The courthouse looked different now. Gone were the intimidating security measures that had once made people feel unwelcome. Instead, there were helpful signs in multiple languages, friendly staff members ready to assist, and a new help desk staffed by volunteer law students who offered free legal guidance to anyone who needed it. Michael Chen, the law student who had recorded the original video, now ran the volunteer program. "After what happened with Ms. Bennett, I knew I had to do more than just study law," he told her as they walked through the building. "I wanted to help make it work for everyone." The biggest change, however, was happening in the judges' chambers. The mandatory bias training program, which Sarah had helped design, was showing remarkable results. Judges were learning to recognize and correct their own biases, and the numbers proved it was working. "Our fine rates are now consistent across all demographics," explained Maria Rodriguez, who had been hired as the court's new community liaison officer. "And more importantly, people feel heard when they come to court. They trust the system more." Judge Harrison had surprised everyone by becoming one of the strongest advocates for change. After his initial suspension and the investigation, he had done something unexpected. He had asked to meet with Sarah privately. "I've been a judge for 30 years, he had told her during that meeting, his voice heavy with emotion. "I thought I knew everything about justice, but watching that video of myself, seeing the data, it opened my eyes to things I have been blind to for decades." Now, 3 months later, Judge Harrison was leading workshops for other judges, sharing his story as a warning and a lesson. "Bias isn't always about conscious hatred," he would tell them. "Sometimes it's about unconscious assumptions we don't even realize we're making." Sarah sat in on one of these workshops, watching from the back of the room as Judge Harrison spoke to a group of his peers. The change in him was remarkable. The arrogant man who had tried to silence her in court was gone, replaced by someone humble and eager to learn. The local police department had also undergone changes. Officer Peterson, who had given Sarah the original ticket, was required to attend additional training. The department now reviewed all traffic stops monthly for signs of bias, and officers wore body cameras at all times. "We're not perfect yet," the new police chief admitted during a community meeting. "But we're learning, we're trying to be better." The stop sign that had started it all had become a symbol of change, now clearly visible, properly maintained, and fair to everyone. The Citizens Justice Committee, which met weekly in the courthouse basement, had grown to include people from all parts of the community. They reviewed court data, suggested improvements, and made sure the reforms stayed on track. Sarah spoke at their meeting, looking out at faces that showed both pride and determination. "What happened here in Millbrook isn't just about fixing one courthouse," she told them. "It's about showing the whole country that change is possible when people work together." The media attention had mostly died down, but the real work continued. Other towns and cities sent representatives to study what became known as the Millbrook model of judicial reform. Sarah's organization received calls daily from communities wanting to implement similar changes. Late one afternoon, as Sarah prepared to leave Millbrook, she stopped by the courthouse one last time. The building was quiet, the day's sessions over. A young mother was at the help desk, getting assistance with some paperwork. A judge was in the hallway, chatting casually with a group of high school students on a field trip. "You know what the best change is?" Maria said, walking with Sarah to her car. "It's that people aren't afraid to come here anymore. They know they'll be treated fairly, no matter who they are." Sarah smiled, remembering the tense morning 3 months ago when she had walked into this same courthouse. The change wasn't just in the building or the procedures. It was in the hearts and minds of the people who worked there and the community they served. 6 months after the traffic stop that changed everything, the Millbrook County Courthouse hosted a special event. The large courtroom was packed with people from all walks of life: community members, legal professionals, activists, and media representatives. They had gathered for the first annual Forum on Judicial Fairness, and Sarah Bennett was the keynote speaker. As Sarah walked to the podium, she noticed how different the courtroom felt. The wooden benches were the same, but the atmosphere had completely changed. Where there had once been fear and tension, there was now a sense of hope and community. Judge Harrison sat in the front row, no longer in his judicial robes but in a simple suit, looking more human than ever. "6 months ago, I stood in this very spot," Sarah began, her voice carrying through the room. "I stood here as someone who had been unfairly treated, but also as someone who knew she had the power to demand change. Not everyone has that power, that privilege, or that platform. That's why what happened here matters so much." She gestured to the diverse crowd. "Look around this room. 6 months ago, many of you wouldn't have felt welcome here. Some of you wouldn't have dared to come at all, but today, this courthouse belongs to everyone." In the audience, Maria Rodriguez sat with her family, wearing her new badge as the court's community liaison officer. Next to her was Michael Chen, now in his second year of law school and running a successful legal aid program. Officer Peterson was there too, having become an advocate for police reform after his own journey of self-reflection. "Change isn't just about new rules or better training," Sarah continued. "It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about helping people see what they couldn't, or wouldn't, see before." She turned to look at Judge Harrison. "Sometimes, the people who resist change the most become its strongest champions once they understand the truth." Judge Harrison stood up, walking to join Sarah at the podium. This moment had been carefully planned, a symbol of how far they had all come. 6 months ago, he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, I was part of the problem. I didn't see my own bias because I didn't want to see it. Miss Bennett didn't just show me what I was doing wrong. She showed me how to do better. Together, they unveiled a new plaque that would hang in the courthouse lobby. It read, "Justice sees no color, knows no bias, fears no truth. In memory of all those who fought for equal treatment under the law, and in commitment to those who continue the fight." The audience stood and applauded, many wiping tears from their eyes. But this wasn't just about emotion, it was about real change. Sarah shared the latest statistics. Bias complaints were down 90%, community trust in the court system had doubled, and other jurisdictions were adopting what was now known nationally as the Millbrook reforms. But our work isn't finished, Sarah reminded everyone. What happened here in Millbrook is just the beginning. Every courthouse in America needs to look at itself honestly. Every judge, every officer, every court employee needs to ask themselves, are we truly serving justice, or are we serving our own biases? After the ceremony, people lingered in the courthouse halls, sharing stories and plans for the future. Young law students crowded around Sarah and Judge Harrison, eager to learn from their experience. Community members who had once feared the courthouse now walked its halls with confidence. As the evening drew to a close, Sarah stood outside the courthouse steps, looking up at the building. The setting sun cast a warm glow on the old stone walls. A young girl walked past with her mother, pointing to the new plaque in the lobby. "Mommy," the girl asked, loud enough for Sarah to hear, "what does justice sees no color mean?" The mother smiled, glancing at Sarah. "It means that in this courthouse, everyone gets treated fairly, no matter who they are." Sarah watched them walk away, thinking about how one moment of standing up for what was right had created waves of change that would affect generations to come. The traffic ticket that had brought her to Millbrook 6 months ago was framed in her office now, a reminder that justice sometimes comes from unexpected places, and that change begins with one person willing to stand up and speak the truth.